Welcome, everyone, to the first of what are going to be weekly podcasts to go along with your journey through the narrative literature of pre-modern India. Now, it promises to be a fun ride, and I'm excited to have you be part of it, so thanks for making the decision to join us. So, where are we going to go exactly over the next 3 months, you ask? We're going to be walking through about 2,000 years of Indian history, believe it or not, from about 200 BC to 1800 CE. By the way, CE means Common Era and BCE means before the Common Era, and that's maybe a more PC way to say AD and BC. Now, so a lot of stuff happened over these 2,000 years, and if we were historians, we could spend this whole time talking about all the incredible things that took place in the Indian subcontinent during this time, from all the different political empires that rose and fell, all the different religions that grew and developed and encountered each other, to all the different ways in which Indian society changed and morphed during this long march towards modernity. That might be fun, but we're not actually going to be historians in this course, in this journey, but instead we're going to be literary scholars. This means that we're more interested in all the different ways that people in India back then and there created and told stories and poems to each other during these 2,000 years before the British arrived and set up colonialism. We'll be looking at the epic, the Ramayana. We'll look at courtly poetry, theater, folk tales, different kinds of devotional poems, and even a smidgen or two of Sufi romance. We're going to try to figure out what was the cultural significance of all of these different types of literature for the world of Indian politics, religion, society, and so on. In a nutshell, what we're going to find out is that literature was a space in which different kinds of ethical ideas were articulated and explored, where certain aesthetics were cultivated, and where different kinds of social and religious identities could be constructed, both for the most elite echelons of educated aristocratic Indian society, but also for the mainstream public. Now, that's a lot to digest, but we'll have 3 months to do it. In this first podcast, what I wanted to do to get us started is to lay down a very basic historical backdrop for our journeys. 2,000 years is going to be a massive amount of time to talk in just a few minutes. So, of course, I'm going to be sort of super general in what I say, but basically we can think of this 2,000-year period of time as falling into 3 different phases. First, there's what's called the post-Mauryan period, which begins around 200 BC. Technically, it's at the fall of the Mauryan Empire in 185 BC, but I think we can round down. Right? And it phased out around 500 BC when the Guptas disintegrated because of the Huns. Secondly, from around year 300 to about 1300, most of the Indian subcontinent was home to a burgeoning classical Sanskrit courtly culture. And then the third phase was a long period of vernacularization, which started actually in different times in different regions of India, over the several centuries between 800 to 1800. Now, as you might have noticed if you were paying attention, there are actually overlaps in these 3 time zones that I've described. That's because history is always a very complicated thing, and culture doesn't just like switch on and off overnight, all at once. The overlap periods actually are what are the most fun and most challenging to investigate, because a lot of different processes you'll find are going on at once in those overlap phases. People are trying different things. Anyway, let's just put on our historians' hats just for this one podcast, and we'll take a closer look at what happened in Indian politics, religion, society, and culture during these 3 phases that I'm talking about. So, first, politics in this post-Mauryan period. The Mauryan Empire, which had been the very first imperial formation of early India, disintegrated around the year 185 BC when a Brahmin general named Pushyamitra Shunga usurped the throne. In the centuries that followed, there were several different regional states all across India that vied for power with one another. There were Indian powers like the Shungas, and the Satavahanas in the Deccan. And also there were foreign powers like the Kushanas or the Shakas and the Persians and the Indo-Greeks way up in Bactria who would come down from the northwest. Eventually, by the year 300, a new kind of dynasty called the Guptas began to consolidate their power in the north and quickly managed to put together a new pan-Indian empire that would last for 2 centuries. So, empire building, we might say, was a really crucial political concept at this time period, and it's something that's going to be directly reflected in the Ramayana, which is the major text, the epic that we're going to be reading from this time period. Now, in terms of religion, this was a time when temple-based popular Hinduism developed in India, which was in contrast to the earlier Vedic fire ritual culture, um, which didn't involve fixed images of gods and fixed holy sites, unlike temples. This was also a time of development of a vast set of mythological narratives that were centered around a set of deities who used to have only minor roles in the early Vedic culture. This is Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess. And again, it's in the Ramayana that we're going to see reflections on these new religious ideas. Indian society in this time took on some new features that have proved to be of critical importance in the history of India. Most of all, maybe, is this idea of caste, the idea that what job you do, who you marry, and what kind of person you are is an intrinsic part of your physical body. Caste was a more fluid thing in the Vedic period, but it was in this post-Mauryan world that it got crystallized. The crystallization of caste also came with a crystallizing of a few other ideas that we kind of take totally for granted now. The ownership of land, the legal processes of inheritance, the status of women, public manners and decency and customs, and many of the basic aspects of everyday civil law got worked out in this time period. Finally, this time period was also when Sanskrit first started being used as a medium of elite poetic expression. Until that time, basically, people spoke in Sanskrit primarily in the context of religious life, in performing the Vedic rituals or debating Upanishadic philosophy. But eventually, bards also started using Sanskrit to write down poetry, to express emotional content, to tell stories, to craft beautiful verbal art. This convergence of Sanskrit elite poetry, Gupta imperial power, and temple-based popular Hinduism would push India into a second phase that we can call Sanskrit courtly culture. Now, politically, after the disintegration of the Gupta Empire at the hands of the Huns around the year 550, we again start to see a long period in which regional states were playing kind of like a large chess game with each other, forming alliances and rivalries, sort of eternally trying to outdo each other. Sometimes they would expand, sometimes they would contract, but always they were kind of uh, integrated into an intricate set of inter-regional trade networks. These trade networks were centered on political courts, but also on market towns. And as they built up the economy of ancient India, these trade pathways also promoted the growth of religious, social, and cultural networks as well. This was a rich period of time, basically. In terms of religion, we see a rise in state sponsorship and large-scale land grants to temples and monasteries all across the subcontinent. And actually, no matter what religion they were, Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain, they all got land grants of one kind or another. And once they started acting as landlords, basically, these temples and monasteries grew more and more powerful all across the countryside. This is also a time when a new set of popular religious movements, known collectively as bhakti, rose across the subcontinent that were motivated by trying to establish a direct, living, passionate, and personal relationship to God. Incidentally, Islam and Christianity also were setting down roots in India towards the end of this time period, especially in the Sindh and Kashmir in North India, and Kerala way down in South India. Socially speaking, what's interesting about this time period is to note that urban culture seems to have taken a fascinating cosmopolitan turn. Cities were places where you could meet all kinds of different people, where you could gain economic and social power, even if you came from an underprivileged background. No matter what your caste was, if you could get rich, you could get clout, right? Even if you were not a Brahmin, even if you were not an aristocrat, even if you were a merchant, an artisan, even a courtesan could get power. Urban life placed uh, uh, class based identities alongside those earlier caste based ones. Now, this cosmopolitanism in the cities and in the royal courts fostered a massive explosion, really, of Sanskrit literary culture during this time period, this Sanskrit courtly period. The high value of Sanskrit meant that anything and everything important in the world of art and science and so on was expressed in the language of Sanskrit. There were Sanskrit texts on architecture, sculpture, dance, theater, philosophy, law, math, chemistry, medicine, all kinds of subjects. And most of all, there was a kind of tremendous proliferation, a flowering really, of poetry and literature in Sanskrit that built off of this cosmopolitan ethos that was going on in the political, religious, and social developments of the Sanskrit courtly sphere. We'll be looking at a handful of texts from the Sanskrit courtly period, the Raghuvansha of Kalidasa, the Uttara Ramacharita of Bhavabhuti, and this Ubhaya Abhisarika of Vararuchi. Now, the third phase of pre-modern Indian cultural history was characterized by a growth of vernacular cultures in various regional kingdoms of India. These were feudal kingdoms, and they had shifting confederacies that are very complex, and they were largely seemed to be concentrated on holding on to localized forms of power and prestige until ultimately the sultanates that were set up by Persian and Turkic and Arab origin rulers in India began to consolidate a different kind of power all across the subcontinent. Now, in terms of religion, this was a time of enormous and vastly important developments in the world of devotional bhakti. They turned into movements all across India where a close, intimate relationship with God or the goddess would be established by singing about him or her, and singing not in an elite register of Sanskrit, but in the popular and natural languages of each region. This time period also saw a further kind of integration of Islamic culture in India, especially the mystical traditions of Sufism. Sikhism is founded in the 16th century, and somewhere during all of these transformations, Buddhism kind of disappears from the subcontinent, except for in Nepal and Bhutan. In terms of society, there's a very interesting egalitarian discourse that emerges from the Bhakti movement, as well as these other new religious movements in India, where the artificial hierarchies and the kind of restrictions of caste and gender and other social differences get dissolved in the kind of united effort of devotional worship to God. Finally, in terms of culture, what's most striking is the flowering of poetic and intellectual and literary traditions, this time not in Sanskrit, but in regional vernacular languages like Old Gujarati, Braj, Awadhi, Kannada, Marathi, and so on. There's a bit of Persian out there too. Poets were thinking globally, but writing for local audiences, right? They were also, interestingly enough, actively experimenting with hybridizing their vernacular poetry with ideas that were being incorporated from Islamic and Persianate cultural traditions, leading to a creation of all kinds of fascinating, really alternative cultural models for identity that were regional in their scope instead of pan-Indian, and non-Brahminical in their sentiment. All right, so that's a quick overview of history of classical and medieval India. Now, I wanted to turn to one other topic before we wrap up this kind of intro podcast, and that's the question of language in pre-modern India. This is a question that's going to be of crucial importance, actually, in all of the texts we're going to be looking at, since these texts are not written in English. They're written either in Sanskrit or in vernacular languages. And so we better make sure we have a good sense of the differences between them before we just assume what they are. So, Sanskrit, it's the classical language of India. It's related to Greek, Latin, Persian, and actually almost all of the modern languages of Europe, in the sense that they all descended from a common ancestral language, which gets the hypothetical name Proto Indo European. In India, Sanskrit became the classical elite language. It was the medium of transmission for the Vedas, the sacred Brahmin texts, and also all other high Brahminical religious and intellectual output. Basically, if you wanted to say something that was smart, that was important, that was sacred or sophisticated at a temple, monastery, school, or a royal court, you had to express it in Sanskrit. It was a language that educated people would know no matter where they lived in India, no matter where they grew up. It was the father tongue, as the great scholar A.K. Ramanujan used to say, in contrast to the mother tongues, which were the vernacular languages. I like that idea very much. In the ancient past, these mother tongues would be called Prakrit languages, and they had various names like Magadhi or Pali or Maharashtri or Lati, and so on. In the South, I should say, the situation was a bit different. There was a second classical language called Old Tamil, which wasn't at all related ancestrally to Sanskrit. And in fact, it has its own separate language family known as the Dravidian language family. So this was an elite classical language situation with Sanskrit and Old Tamil, and then the vernacular Prakrits. Now, those were the major languages in which classical literature was composed for a good 1,000 years or more. A bunch of literature was actually also written in the different Prakrits. It wasn't all just Sanskrit, but we'll be really looking at the Sanskrit in this course. Now, towards the end of the first millennium, the regional vernaculars started getting really popular as a language, as languages for poetic and literary expression. If you wanted to sing songs and tell stories, you did it in the vernaculars, not in Sanskrit. In the north, the vernaculars were all descended from Sanskrit, like Hindi, Marathi, Gujarati, Punjabi, and Bangla, and so on. In the south, languages like Kannada and Tamil, they all have come from Old Tamil. So starting around 800 in the different places, different regional courts in the medieval period, also in temples and in schools and so on, people started using vernaculars to make poetry, to tell stories, to write down decrees, shopping lists, textbooks, all kinds of things, right? Now, it was also one of the main hallmarks of vernacular expression of the Bhakti religious movements where devotional poetry was written down in vernaculars and not usually in Sanskrit. So why did they do this? This mainly seems to be because unlike Sanskrit, the vernaculars allowed people in power, anyone really, to communicate horizontally. It allowed your writing to appeal and to be heard by mass audiences. Women, non-elite communities could all understand and appreciate what a poet was saying, what a scholar was saying, what a king was saying, right? This would be in contrast to Sanskrit, which is a vertical channel of communication, and it's only understood by the most elite, the most educated in medieval India. It's important, I think, to keep this vertical versus horizontal structuration in mind as we're going further in our readings. The other fascinating thing that happened during the medieval period is a deep integration of non-Indic vocabularies into the Indian languages, especially, of course, Persian and Arabic words through the influence of Islam. To a lesser extent, Portuguese and French also do get integrated into Indian languages, especially if you go into the coastal areas or in South India, where there was a higher degree of trade contact with Europeans. One of the key developments in this period of linguistic hybridization was the language of Urdu, which has basically the same grammar as Hindi in North India, but it uses many, many words that are taken from Persian and Arabic rather than from Sanskrit. We'll see some of this when we get to the last text in our course, Manjan's Old Deccani Urdu Madhumalati. Okay, so That's great for now. A nice little overview of how Indian history went through three different phases over the 2,000 years from 200 BC till 1800 CE. And then we had a little bit about how two different kinds of languages created vertical and horizontal channels of communication that fostered both an elite literary culture in India through the medium of Sanskrit and a non-elite public culture mostly through the medieval vernacular languages. So, see you next time when we'll basically just dive right into the Ramayana and ask the pointed question, was Valmiki a real person? Right? Did he actually compose the Ramayana after seeing a hunter kill a bird? And then did he really teach it to Rama's own sons? Stay tuned.